In this episode of Airs for Architecture, I spoke with Victoria Jane Marshall, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Architecture at the National University of Singapore, about her book Periurban Cartographies, Kolkata's Ecologies and Settled Ruralities, published by Oro Editions in spring this year.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Victoria Jane Marshall, scholar and not architect, about periurban cartographies. Victoria, before we go on and talk about your book, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Hi Ambrose, thanks for inviting me. I am a senior lecturer at the Department of Architecture at the National University of Singapore, and I'm also a director of the Masters of Landscape Architecture program at National University of Singapore.
So you're a landscape architect?
My training is landscape architecture. I did my undergrad in Australia at the University of New South Wales, and then I moved to the US and I did a master's in landscape architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, along with urban certificate in urban design. And then I practiced landscape architecture and urban design. And then I did a PhD in geography here in Singapore at the National University of Singapore. And I completed that in 2021. And that's really the foundation of the book, is that PhD.
That's quite a long journey.
I could never predict it. It's definitely curiosity-led, definitely.
So a PhD in, you described it as geography?
Yeah, cultural geography.
Cultural geography. And how do you define cultural geography? I think we're used to thinking about political and physical geography, perhaps.
Yeah, here at NUS, the research group is social and cultural geographies. That body of scholarship has lots of overlaps in landscape. There's important scholarship on landscape that came from geography in the 90s. A lot of scholarship on nature and the politics of nature. There's also influenced landscape architecture. And of course, urban studies is all cultural geography as well. And that also influences urban design, urban studies, landscape architecture and architecture, urban design. So I've been reading geography, cultural geography for a long time. In my world as a designer, as a landscape architect, urbanist.
That's great.
Yeah, that's the So it's the old split between physical geography and cultural geography.
I think it's an important background to kind of get in place, because this book, Periurban Cartographies, Kolkata's Ecologies and Settled Ruralities, which is something of a break from the norm for this podcast. It's a very interesting piece of research. Very beautiful book, by the way. Oh, published by Oro Editions, of course, next month. Very beautiful piece of work, beautifully illustrated, as Oro books tend to be. It seems to introduce a kind of design thinking. That's where I going through it, I was kind of really struck. So it makes sense that you are a designer. Is that a fair thing to say? Do you feel like your design background has brought something specific and unique, perhaps, to the sort of cultural geography field?
Well, it's not for me to say. It's for others to say, I guess, after the book comes out.
But just the way you engage with the phenomena at hand, the periurban condition, do you feel like?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I can speak to that. The social sciences is really an art of understanding, right? You have to. I mean, all you have to do is to understand, and to do that is really hard, and to do that well is also an art. And so I wanted to learn how to do that, and but as a trained landscape architect and urbanist, I bring like a close attention to things that I've been trained to look at. And so that's the designer in me coming through into geography. So I know how to really look closely at landscape to say what's going, why is that tree dying? Why is that house dilapidated? And really ask the questions to try and try to understand. So I think maybe you saw that coming through in the book.
I did, and I want to come back onto that later. This issue around the method of inquiry that you've deployed here, which I found really fascinating. Incredibly detailed study of a place and using that to explore wider meanings, which again perhaps we can come on to. But where did this book come from? Obviously, as you say, it's your doctoral thesis, recharged on steroids, completed rather than just completed. But why did you get to this point with someone with your story, your lineage, so to speak, from Australia to America to Singapore? How come Kolkata?
Yeah, in 2010, I received a fellowship from the India-China Institute in New York. And that institute was founded in 2005 at the New School in New York, where I was teaching at the time, to support scholars that either studied India or China and they wanted to have a comparative approach, or for scholars that studied neither but were interested to get to do research in a comparative way, and look at both together. And I was in the latter group, so I never studied India or China, but I just wanted to. So I received the fellowship with a proposal to look at the Ganges River Delta urbanization and Yangtze River urbanization. And I did that. And but I found the comparative, and I every time I wasn't teaching, I got on a plane and I was walking around different places in India and China for from 2010 to 2014 actually was my period of intense field work. But then the pulling it together project, the project of comparison, I found really hard because I was not trained in it. And there's an art of comparativism, and so I tried to teach myself that, but at some point I realized I need a teacher. And so I got offered the opportunity to do my PhD with Jane M. Jacobs here at NUS, who's an important cultural geographer in the field of comparativism. And then at some point, I just dropped the China side and decided to focus on an India case study that can speak back out to comparativism in another way. So that's the role of the case study, which maybe we can talk a bit about more. Why I just decided to go in deep into 1 kilometer square. So it was that trajectory. At some point I decided it was really hard to continue the research from New York. So either I leave the research or I follow it. So I decided to move to Singapore, and also, obviously be a bit closer to my family in Australia. And so, there's that sort of bundle of reasons led me here in Singapore to study India and be in the region to understand, the periurban monsoon Asia, that's what I term it, condition across the region. I wanted to be right in the middle of it. So Singapore was perfect for me.
I'd quite like to understand this comparativism that you have mentioned, and why you felt that this comparative study that you were initially engaged in between the Yangtze and the Ganges struggled. wasn't what you wanted, and then how you came to selecting this particular site, this particular moment in Kolkata. I mean, so you go from a massive geographical area down to an area that's 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. That's quite interesting, and maybe that's the landscape architect and not the geographer in you.
Yeah.
The particularist rather than the generalist in you.
Yeah, I in landscape architecture, it's still going on, but there's a trend of doing these very large scale infrastructural projects, and
Mm.
everyone's work is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I was in that ambition when I got the fellowship. But then I was in the fellowship, I was the designer in the room. I was surrounded by political scientists, economists and geographers, and they were asking different questions about, I don't know, I decided I wanted to learn how to do social research. I wanted to interview people and create knowledge from their stories. And so I just found that through doing all this field work and a lot of drawing and a lot of looking, but not a lot of talking, I felt there was a limit to my tools, and I wanted to, and I learned that through the big project. So it was like limits of my knowledge, but also curiosity to learn the skills of creating knowledge through doing the field work.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the comparative part was something we all struggled with in the institute, and I guess it still goes on. But the way through it is what my teacher told me is something we can talk a bit more about, which comes from the Ordinary City Scholarship and Jennifer Robinson and sort of thinking through elsewhere that I got super excited about in my research.
I don't wish to be one of those people, but I was reading your book, and when I saw Jennifer Robinson's Ordinary Cities, that was the first doctoral seminar I ever attended, was her talking about that book. And I use that book in my teaching too. It's a remarkably good book, just this little Routledge kind of edition. Anyway, it's an amazing book. I would love you to talk a little bit more about that. But I want to understand this idea of periurbanism and periurbanization and what the periurban is. Where does it come from? Like, what's its origin story as a concept, as I guess, spatial urban reality, as a distinct thing that's characteristic of our epoch? All of these questions. What is it to begin with?
I have a whole chapter on it in my book.
Don't read it.
So I'm not going to. I encourage people to take a look at that. I just went in and I charted where it emerged, how it has changed over time and place, and it's had many terms, and the lexicon has changed over time, and so just like a quick summary is. The early definitions were about edge of the city. That's more the 50s and the 60s. And then in the 80s and the 90s, it was more about the extension of the city. So the way cities and towns and regions connect together. And they start to call that sort of extended urban region, the periurban. And then the meaning of the periurban shifted again, and that has a different reading in the global north and the global south. And then more recently, there's an understanding of the periurban as being irrelevant, because everything is urban. And so it's sort of now considered old-fashioned idea. It went from edge to this, when cities start to form extended regions, that whole region start to be thought of as the periurban.
Mm-hmm.
And then it became redundant. But I sort of revisit it as a meaningful term because it is what is used in Kolkata. It is an everyday term. I'm not inventing a term. So it does have power there. So I chose to keep it for that reason. And it's meaningful because, we're in this big, global urban transition, and a lot of that future urban, like the imaginary of future urbanization is in the negotiation, is being negotiated in the periurban. And so that's why it's important. Maybe you can call it the urban rural, the hybrid space where the settled rural and the becoming urban mix, or where they co-become. That's how I look at peri-urban.
Yeah, but it's distinct from suburban. Like, why not just suburban? That's a nice old word. It goes all the way back to the 1980s or something. Like, why do we need periurban? What is distinct? And you use this word hybrid. This is a hybrid space. Is this the key to it? Is it a space, as you said, a space becoming, a hybrid space becoming, rather than a kind of a fixed typology characteristic of what we see as suburban?
Yeah, in my understanding, the suburban is a particularly, global north story, and so peri-urban is a way to speak more generally about how the urban and the rural settle, or how urban settlement happens, more broadly, in and around and beyond cities. So that's one way to sort of put the suburban inside the concept of periurban. It's like a bigger container that can hold the suburban. And then it is generally imagined as, and I write about this in the book a lot, as becoming urban. And generally, in doing so, it sort of erases the rural in the imagination of it just being a zone which is on its way to become urban, like a transition zone. And that's a very linear teleological. And so my project aims to sort of not be teleological and not just to sort of unlearn the thought of it as a space that's becoming urban, and to look more flat and more even at everything that's going on, and not bifurcate, not separate urban and rural, and not separate society and nature, but look at how they're all entangled together. So that's my contribution to the imaginary of the peri-urban. That's my response to how it's being used, and to sort of open it up differently. And so it's meaningful because, like I said, it's where the urban future is being negotiated, but in general, it erases the settled rural, and thinks of it just as a blank space for the future to play out. But what I'm saying is that actually there's always a lot, particularly in monsoon Asia, there's a very long settled rural there that absorbs and transforms urbanization in different ways in different places. And so I just look super closely at one of them, which is in southwest Kolkata. But I could really have looked anywhere in monsoon Asia, in the former rice growing areas, or rice growing areas in monsoon Asia.
What do you think is specific about the characteristic of peri-urbanization in the context of Kolkata that differentiates it, say, from examples? I'm thinking about the blue banana concept theory up here, or I can't remember what it's called, the golden something or other, the golden crescent of another one, and East Coast America, industrial East Coast America, and then West Coast America.
The megalopolis.
Yeah, the megalopolis, and the mega city, meta city, all of this kind of
Yeah.
What differentiates, and you know, when we think of those kinds of places, I mean, perhaps the Blue Banana, you know, this stretch of alleged urbanization that exists between essentially Dublin and Milan in a great swathe across Europe. We understand that as being a kind of, it's an interesting concept, and it might be true for the 0.01% of people who fly around doing business and academics who do conferences in those same places. It's not really true, but it looks good on a map. But I can understand it in having experienced Southeast Asia myself and Southern Asia, and understand it more in that context. But is there something very specific and particular about the context in which you're exploring it? How do you go about measuring this peri-urban condition in the Kolkata?
I guess I don't measure it. I more describe it because it hasn't been described. That's my action.
Mm-hmm.
And I also visualize it. That's my action.
Mm-hmm.
I am part of a research group at the ETH, Singapore Future Cities Lab, Agropolitan Futures of Monsoon Asia, Agropolitan Territories, sorry, of Monsoon Asia Lab. And they have a tool there called Earthscape that measures periurban Monsoon Asia. And I use that as a tool in my teaching. So I have a map that they gave me, and I tell my students pick somewhere and take a look at it. So there is a map of periurban Monsoon Asia, but I'm part of that group, but I didn't create that. Although I use it a lot. But if I go back to the definition of periurban, so that moment where there was it started to be imagined not as the edge of the city, but as this extended, urban area, the Blue Banana, the megalopolis. So that's the global north imaginary, the periurban. At the same time, the periurban was engaged in the global south, but it was not theorized like it was in the global north. So there's a lot of thinking by architects in sort of theorizing and thinking through the spatial patterns and the spatial experience and the life of and the arrangement of peri-urban or urban rural or extended urban conditions like the Blue Banana and the megalopolis and more, the diffuse city and those others. But in the global south, it was more the thinking about peri-urban was more of through the scholarship on development and was thought of as a problem. So that's where the scholarship, where all the narratives of the problematic megacity and the edge as a disaster and as a crisis and as basically as a problem that needed to be fixed. Mm. And so it was not theorized and thought through, but rather just troubled, thought of as troubled and as underdeveloped and as less developed and as developing, right? And all of that imaginary that was sort of loaded onto it. But in that moment, in the 80s and the 90s, there was some theory done, and the important theory was done by this geographer called Terry McGee, and he coined this term, and he was looking at the peri-urban or the urban rural areas around Jakarta in Indonesia, and he coined this term desa kota, village city in Bahasa, which was this extended region that was different than what was being theorized in the global north. And so the desa kota did what Jennifer Robinson was interested in, and what, it spoke back to the theorization of what our urban future is from the global south. And so my research really, builds on the desa kota story. And the desa kota, have you heard about the desa kota?
I have indeed.
Yeah.
But open it up a bit, I think, because it's a really good word. The kind of it's the kind of word that architects will get hold of and misuse in all sorts of wonderful ways.
Yeah, and that's okay.
It's not okay. It's not okay. I think architects forget that other people's disciplines actually have stable concepts, whereas ours doesn't really. Anyway.
Sure, yeah, yeah. I mean, for me, sometimes as long as you're playing with it, it's good that it's active and alive.
Oh, I suppose so, yes.
Yeah, but
That's
yeah,
very
so
generous of you.
yeah, so McGee and his colleagues, they took this finding from Jakarta, looking at the periurban Jakarta, and then started to look at desiccator regions in Asia more broadly, and of course, and they sort of identified a desiccator around Kolkata and in China and everywhere, and desiccator is important because it's not conceptualized as an extended, it is called like he calls it an extended urban region, but most importantly, it's a condition where the urban and the rural both benefit. And for McGee, it's an economic model. So the rural is benefiting from being enmeshed within the urban, and the urban is benefiting from being enmeshed in the rural.
Mm.
And so it goes both ways. And it happens in the 80s and the 90s in Asia. It's also about place and time. And there's a certain, moment in time where urbanization here changed, where the technology of transportation changed, particularly the motorcycle, allowed like more circulation of people, and also sort of increase in economic and industrial activity, got reinforced in already existing sort of extended urban regions. So it intensified, forming this large territory where urban and rural start to do something unique and different that did not exist anywhere else in the world. And he reports on that, and then goes looking for it elsewhere. And so that's a great base, but he doesn't look through, there's limits to it. And so I respond to that by looking through the lens, not just through the lens, an economic lens, but through the lens of power, through the lens of landscape, and through the lens of non-human agency that I talk about a lot in the book. So yeah, periurban scholarship from the global south informs my work, but I respond to it in my unique way, based on my training.
I like the way that you've described it, and you've used some really, I think, very interesting and important phrases. This idea around an imaginary, for one, and this idea of talking back to the global north as another, as a kind of, I mean, does this mean that the periurban, as you encounter it, as you describe it in your work, is sort of inherently a post-colonial position that is, like Jennifer Robinson, not predicated on a kind of an assumption that to be modern is to be Western, and where cities in the global south are trying to get to is to be like Manhattan Island or the city of London, heaven forfend, but instead are finding their own modernity and their own forms of urban-rural hybridity, which we haven't really properly encountered because we continuously engage with them from the position of them being not up to scratch per our standards.
Yeah, the idea of speaking back comes from Gayatri Spivak. She's from Kolkata. But Jennifer Robinson and my supervisor, Jane M. Jacobs.
That's not the Jane Jacobs.
No, it is not. It's otherwise known as the other Jane Jacobs.
Just thought we'd get that clear, because that's a mic drop. If that were true, that would be the mic drop to end it all. But I was assuming that she had passed away. I didn't look it up on Wikipedia. I just wanted to be...
No, she's not around, but the other Jane Jacobs is completely around.
And I'm sure equally as brilliant, but anyway.
Yeah, important post-colonial scholar from Australia and also UK and Singapore. So rather than frame it as North and South speaking back, I got excited and I'm trying to enact a practice of participating in and mobilizing comparativism. So what that means is there's many case studies that look at the cities that we know, New York, London, Singapore, where I am now, Shanghai, everywhere. And those are the cities that are imagined and also thought through to start to think of what is the urban future and what is a good urban. And then Jennifer Robinson opens up the possibility that we haven't really thought enough because we don't know enough, and there's so many other urban conditions out there. And so she asks, what if we look elsewhere? And in looking elsewhere, there's sort of not enough deep knowledge. And so you can't really do the comparative work until there's the deep studies from elsewhere to then start to see what they say to everything everywhere else. And so I feel I like that idea of contributing to future comparative work through and offering my work as a case study in that. So I don't know what my work might be used to compare with, but I hope that in doing so, it opens up or unlearns some imaginaries of what a good urban future might be, or the places from which we imagine the future might get diversified, or the urban future that is created in the area that I studied might actually be recalibrated. So that's the practice of it, of comparativism, that I'm trying to enact. So it's not so much global north and south, but it's more just getting a seat at the table and doing so from somewhere else, but doing so with a very deep study. And I really like this idea. It's very, I don't know, democratic in a way. So I'm going with it.
Could you talk a little bit about this notion of a deep study? Two things. I mean, you've obviously the book is a cartographic book in a sense. I would like to understand a little bit better this idea of cartography and mapping within your work. What role you think it plays, what value you think it brings specifically to this? Because obviously your book deals with, in this particular context of Kolkata, a series of plans, like physical plans, planning documents, policy plans to deal with the urban condition and peri-urban condition, rural condition in and around Kolkata. And you present them. You then also use mapping as a device in its own right. And as I said at the beginning, these are very seductive and beautiful images, almost like art. I'd quite like to understand the process by which you came to them, what value you think they bring as a research method to understanding the urban condition, and how they help and encourage this detailed study. That basically is the entirety of a PhD viva in a single question.
Thanks.
So good luck with that.
Yeah, I should be writing this down, and I'm just like listening, like I can remember everything.
No. So, but basically, what is cartography in this context? Like, what do you mean by cartography? What is your cartography, and why are you deploying it?
All right, I work in the tradition of critical cartography from geography. You can read Krieger and Crampton and many other scholars on the topic. And this is another one of those things like landscape and nature society that move across from geography to architecture and design. So critical cartography or critical mapping is a big important tool in landscape architecture and urbanism. And that was written about in the 90s. In the book, what I do is I look at the maps that have been made of Kolkata, and I analyze them. I write about them. So I look at the maps the cartographic practices that others have engaged in creating the territories of the area that I study, and I reflect on those. So that's the first chapter in the book, or one of the chapters in the book is my look around at the maps that have been made, and then I respond to them by what I call re-rendering the territory in my own way. And so the book has a lot of the historic maps that I found, archival, the British the remarkable British maps of Kolkata and the Bengal Delta that I found in the archives in Kolkata, in Delhi, and in London. And as well as, you know, all of the maps that were produced in the reform period since the 1990s by the Indian government, that are really hard to find, that are really sort of mangled by being overproduced digitally and being sort of found in boxes of reports that are eaten by insects, and so the quality of the map as a thing, I also write about. And so I imagine, I know map, I write a lot more about cartographic practices and cartographic elements and cartographic objects, you know, less than the maps, and as well as, like, let's say, the maps themselves. And then I enact my own mapping or cartographic practice. And so that and then I write about that and like all the decisions I made on the various elements inside the maps that I made, that I create. So if I try to talk better, I chose a 1 kilometer square area in southwestern Kolkata, and I had two amazing fieldwork research assistants, some Bengali recent graduates from the University of Kolkata. And we headed off every second day, and we went to the study area and we walked it. And it was possible to walk the sort of loop in the area in about an hour and a half, slowly. And we did a few walking practices. One was a transect. We did 3 intentional transect walks. I did some a whole series of interviews that we tried to collect interviews or talk with people from across the area and from different age groups and different sort of income levels. So in that walking practice was this sort of stopping people and knocking on their door and asking if they'd be interested to talk to us. And then backing out of that story, the stories they told me, I collected base data from the municipality, who was very helpful and supportive of my research. And I sort of, coming backwards from the stories, I started to draw. And so I used some basic methods of drawing. I decided to use very simple cartographic methods of symbols and boundaries and what I call invented shading. And I describe each of these elements in detail about why I use them in a way that others can also learn and use the cartographic method that I created. So I did this for in some ways because a lot of landscape architecture representations are so complex and somewhat obtuse and sort of hard to enter, and you feel like they're super compelling, but you don't quite know what's going on. I wanted to create a really, really ordinary map language that is so straightforward that the complexity of the stories that I was hearing could be seen and to come through them. So what I did was I created a map, a cartographic language, and a series of layered maps, layered data in an Illustrator file. And as I start to write the narratives of the story of the place, which I have 3 empirical chapters, I bring in or I collect certain layers in a set of maps as I go through narrating the story of the place. And so the combination of text, map, and photograph, the book toggles between all three. And as you move through the three chapters, you can start to hold the complexity and visualize it, and not be and start to untangle it and learn it, because in the way that it's represented by the state, it's mapped as vacant. And so or waste land, and so, or just as residential. And so the combination of text, map, and photograph, colors that white space on the map, but it does not confuse people. It aims to disentangle it and narrate it. And it's structured somewhat chronologically, but it's also structured, I guess this is the designer in me, but it's structured spatially in that different areas within the study area are going through different dynamics. So like you cross the street and something is going through something different than the other side. So each chapter can be also thought of not just chronologically, but happening simultaneously. And so I also write about that.
Yes. There is a
Yeah.
strong sense, I think, in the book, and I'm kind of fascinated by it, of the aesthetic qualities and to what extent the aesthetic exercise of producing research of this kind, this tripartite research of discussions, observations, and mapping, becomes in a way a device, I suppose, that curates the research questions in a peculiar kind of way. I mean, I think that's a topic for another discussion, but I think it's a fascinating possibility with design thinking in research, that the inherently aesthetic mind of the designer starts coordinating the learning outcomes. To go back to what you're saying through this approach to mapping, to cartography, is that in a way there's a democratization that goes on through this less opaque form of mapping, which would enable its encounter by ordinary people, non-specialist people, that is to say, academics or landscape architects, or whatever it is. And then therefore it tells us something more clearly, something very specific more clearly. But it also helps in the democratization process there in Kolkata by explaining through this process of documenting the varieties of periurbanization and hybridization back to the authority. So it's not only is it talking back to the global north potentially, but it's also talking back to power differentials and inequalities within a context which is somewhat seen as just a homogenous other, underdeveloped, global south, third world, slum, whatever, informal, blah, 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 blah.
Mm, mm.
Is that right?
That's a great summary.
Well.
I mean, I would also say it's a mapping of territory through the household.
Uh-huh.
And that's important to state. And that I was tasked with trying to do radical clarity of the map project.
Who tasked you with that? Who tasked you?
My supervisor. So I kept simplifying it more and more and more and more and more. And that was initially uncomfortable for me, but in time I got into it. And then in terms of simple things, Kolkata is full color. India is full color. It's completely saturated visually. And so I tried to also express that and not, there is a tendency to, when you go for radical clarity, to be black and white and figure ground and like all of that. But I wanted to keep the quality of being fully alive and full color in the way my choice of colors and things like that. So I didn't want to lose the place in stripping it back so much. And then I'm interested to take it back and see, take the work back and to actually enact what I've done.
Yeah.
So it doesn't end with the book.
No, and that was the last question I wanted to ask was, do you think that there is, rather than this kind of hands-off approach in which we encounter and accept other modernities, is there, to some degree, learning here for contexts in the global north? Is this a methodology of research and encounter that could have an application and reveal important things up here?
I think everywhere there's interest in participatory practices and doing work with people, and then, you know, taking it away and reflecting it and bringing it back, and then like that sort of more iterative practice. So I think everyone is trying to figure that out. So it could just be another contribution to that. Some examples for what it might open up, and this is coming through in my teaching, because I've been here 3 years teaching since I finished the PhD. I've done 3 periurban studios now, and I have also some beautiful thesis students doing periurban projects in the architecture program. And we start to draw differently we don't use the master plan, and we create what I call these increments plans. So these drawings that show incremental change. I taught a studio where we opened up and rethought the topic of density, which was written a lot about by this geographer called Colin McFarlane. And so it's opened up a research topic on density that might be interesting to think through from elsewhere than here. And then power, like asking architecture and design students to sort of learn to analyze how power is arranged in a place and how their project rearranges that power, like how they imagine power can be rearranged. So these are the lessons that come from when you're working in an area where there's not the strong state like Singapore, or where they use the master plan and things are drawn and then built. But outside of here, there's a lot of places that where urbanization emerges, and I should state that the area that I looked at was middle class, lower middle, not English speaking middle class India. And villages that have their own hierarchies of the elite village member and the not elite village member, and so power is arranged there, and a project rearranges power. A design project does, and so, but you can't, as a designer, you can't go imagining a master plan because the governance doesn't support it. They don't function that way. And so there's important lessons for thinking through design in the periurban that might be important for other places as well. The places that don't get attention, that can hold ideas for thinking through the future in the global north. I'm just riffing. These things I haven't really thought about. But I can say I got a grant, and I'm looking to take the work in a more expanded format, in a more like curated exhibition format with others, to India, to Australia, and to New York if I can. And if someone wants me to come to UK, I'll come and bring it and sort of have this conversation, because I really believe in this in the periurban, and I really believe that if we can have people learning to practice there, I think it will be really powerful, because a lot of architecture and designers are taught to practice the urban and to think through the fully urban here in Singapore. And so when they do work on the edge, they're still imagining it as becoming urban. But then what I've learned through my students is that, first of all, they don't imagine being a periurban architect. And I ask, why not? Why can't we imagine that? And or landscape architect. That's where their dream is to practice. I'm saying, what if, And the other is, I don't know, like more about the unlearning that has to go through to do that work, to stop starting with a position of trying to draw what's rural and what's urban and what's nature and what's society, but to just start drawing the entanglements and looking at what's working and try to support that. Because so much of the training, I think I'm sort of starting to see it, but a lot of this analysis is taught for students to go in and find the problem, and they just paint places negatively. Circulation is bad, it's dirty, it's polluted, and so then they want to fix it. But rather than being trained to see what's working and to look at the practices that are doing that are coping and staying above water in a tricky situation and trying to find and to support that. Periurban designers with that type of skill, I try to argue, will be really valuable in the future. So that's something I think can translate.
Well, that's a great point to finish on.
Okay.
Victoria, that was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so very much.
Okay, great.
Perfected poem, powerful punchlines, pummeling petty powder puffs in her prime. It's almost as if Black Alicious wrote that song thinking of Victoria. Thank you to her and for her wonderful book, and for taking the time to speak with me about it. Please see the podcast descriptions for links to it and to Victoria, and thanks for listening.